All right. Hello, everybody. Once again, thank you for joining public meeting regarding Regulation 2.04, the Advance Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. Bear with me 1 second as I try and get the slideshow going. Here we go. So just real quick, gonna spend about 5 minutes just saying hi, welcome to everybody, and letting you all know that I am not the only APCD person on here. I have support from Interim Director Rachel Hamilton, our Air Pollution Control Officer and Permitting Manager Matt King, our Director of Program Planning, and my manager Michelle King, and a handful of other engineers who know a lot more about how all this works than I do. So they may jump in if you have a question that I can't answer, or that they can probably answer better than me. We'll move into the overview of the rule and the ANPR in just a minute, and then have plenty of time for Q&A. The meeting is slated to go from 6 till 7:30 or until discussion ends. So, once the presentation's over, take any Q&A, and if there is a, significant break of 5 minutes or so, at any point, we may go ahead and end. The meeting is being recorded today, and we'll post it to the website afterwards. Just a little bit of housekeeping first. I have the window open in my room because it is kind of hot in here. But if it starts hailing sideways through that window, I may have to hop up and shut it real quick. So if I disappear, I'm just preventing flooding. On WebEx stuff, if you hover over the bottom of your screen, you can bring up the controls. Everybody was muted and video off by default, but you have the power to control that yourself. This is a free public meeting. We do ask that folks raise your hand before speaking, but I am not always going to catch that. I'll do my best and have support from other folks, but if I don't catch anybody and you have a question, feel free to pop it in the chat, or feel free to just unmute yourself and ask. And if you feel more comfortable being seen, feel free to start your own video, but totally understand this is an after-hours meeting. Feel free to keep it off. If you are on the phone listening in, I don't think anybody is. As I scrolled through the participants, I didn't see anybody listed just as a phone number, but in case anybody is, you can also hit *3 on your phone to raise your hand. And I can unmute you for you. And last bit there is just about your video. Last bit, that little bubble, of course, is the chat option. And we are taking comments or even just questions at airregs@louisvilleky.gov at any time. The comment period on this action is open until Friday at 5. So only a couple more days to comment, but we will release a full proposed rulemaking after this. I'll get into how all that works toward the end of the presentation. But thank you for attending, and welcome from Louisville Metro Air Pollution Control District. Anybody have any questions? Everybody hear me all right before I jump into the presentation itself? All right. Oops. Sorry, wrong button here. All right. So as I said, this is regarding Regulation 2.04, the Advance Notice of Proposed Rulemaking for what will be version 8 of the rule. Just a little background on what brought this about. This slide should be familiar to most people. This is the trend for ozone in Louisville. As you can see, the National Ambient Air Quality Standard, those large colored blocks, is periodically reviewed and strengthened by EPA. That usually means lowered based on new science showing what the health effects are. Louisville's what we call design value has continued to improve, but not quite kept pace with that standard. So as of the end of 2020, the preliminary, or that may be final soon anyway, design value for 18 through 2020 is still 72 parts per billion, or 0.072 parts per million, which is still 0.002 parts per million over the National Ambient Air Quality Standard. For this reason, in 2018, we were designated non-attainment, marginal non-attainment for that ozone standard. Based on the SIP requirements or state implementation plan requirements from EPA, that meant that a year later we had to start doing conformity. This past year now, our emissions inventory for the area and an update to our emission statement rule were due. That emission statement rule has been updated. We're still working with EPA and DAQ on getting the finishing touches on that base year emissions inventory submitted, but should be submitted finally soon. And then this year, by August 3rd, so 3 years after redesignation, designation as non-attainment, our non-attainment new source review rule is due. We're required to have this because we are a non-attainment area. This year is also our attainment deadline, which means that within 6 months after that attainment deadline, we either have to show that we have met it, or EPA is required to reclassify us to a higher classification of moderate non-attainment. And depending on which way that goes, from 2021 all the way out until at least 2041, we will have additional requirements coming into play. Just to go through where we are in the rulemaking process. This is one that was easy to identify. It's straightforward. We have to update our new source review rule. It's a requirement from being designated non-attainment. We put together a work group internally late last year, discussed what needed to be done. We scoped that, drafted an ANPR internally, and reviewed it. So we're through those first 4 blocks, which are mostly internal review, at least for this particular rule, and then ANPR almost a month ago now. This ANPR outlines a few different options, but one way or another, we will propose some amendments to Regulation 2.04. So the next step will be getting together the strategy committee, I believe. No, policy committee, I'm sorry, and asking them to release for public an actual formal proposal. So that next step is that formal public review and public hearing. And finally, hopefully sometime in early summer or so, we'll have board action so we can get this submitted by that deadline in August. Just a little bit more about this process real quick. This ANPR, we are taking what we call informal comments. So if you have opinions by Friday on what sort of action we should take as outlined, then we want to hear from you. This public meeting is more a chance for folks to ask questions. If you don't understand what we're proposing or what the options are or how this whole thing works at all, or any question at all, that's what this meeting is really about. If you have a comment, we appreciate that in writing after this meeting. Just a little bit more about what non-attainment new source review is. The requirement from the Clean Air Act, Section 172C5. Such plan provisions shall require permits for the construction and operation of new or modified major stationary sources anywhere in the non-attainment area in accordance with Section 173 of the Clean Air Act. There are also requirements further down in Part D of Title I of the Clean Air Act. So there are a few other sections of the Clean Air Act that come into play, but that's the basic requirement there. So what new source review is generally, it applies to new sources or modifications greater than 100 tons of either NOx or VOCs, or significant increase, i.e. greater than 40 tons for marginal non-attainment areas of either NOx or VOCs at a source that is an existing major source. And that is the same for attainment and non-attainment areas. So in attainment areas, we call new source review PSD. The application is pretty much the same, but what happens when that kicks in is different for non-attainment areas. So in non-attainment areas, instead of what we call in PSD, BACT or best available control technologies, sources are instead required to implement lowest achievable emissions rate or LAER. In addition, it's not as simple as just going through that review and making sure that you're applying LAER. Emissions offsets are required. For a marginal area, it's every increase is required to be offset by 1.1 decrease from another source or the same source within the non-attainment area. Right now in version 7, the offset is actually 1.15 to 1 for VOCs. And then a little bit more about this ANPR. So we are soliciting comments on a range of options. We haven't decided or made any official proposal on what way we're going to go right now. 2.04 already exists and in theory would already apply to news sources in the non-attainment area. However, it does need at least some minor updates. There are some outdated cross-references, and there are some requirements that we haven't quite met yet, we believe. But that could be fixed with a relatively minor correction to 2.04. We're considering everything from those sort of minor corrections all the way to a more complete overhaul to match the way the federal regulations that kick in for areas that don't have their own news source review program, the way those are structured. And we'll get into what's different in just a little bit, but most of those changes have been made since 2002 in a series of actions that it calls news source review reform. All right, so that news source review reform, NSR reform, started in December 2002 with the NSR improvements rule. It made a host of changes. The three most significant that are still remaining, another number of those were reviewed by courts. These are the ones that remain from after that litigation settled, I think around 2005. But the three most significant ones that remain are changes to how baseline emissions are calculated. Currently in 2.04 version 7, there are a range of options that generally come down to sources being able to choose any consecutive 2-year period within the past 5 years. EPA previously to 2002 didn't even allow 5 years. It was the past 2 years. But they expanded that to a look-back period of the past 10 years to decide what sort of an appropriate baseline for calculating whether there was a significant increase was. The second was they added a new actual to projected actual applicability test. Previously, sources were required to compare their previous actual baseline emissions to what the potential emissions from any modifications being considered were. The final is the new plant-wide applicability limits, or PALs. This is a optional plant-wide limit that sources can take, such that if they don't exceed that plant-wide limits, then new source review doesn't come into play. This may sound familiar, as we do have that in our PSD regulation already, and at least a couple sources have taken advantage of that. There were two more recent reforms. The project aggregation rule in 2018. This was considered by EPA to be more a clarification. They did not actually do a substantial rewrite of the rules, but they did state that just because activities occurred close in time or even at the same time doesn't mean they were substantially related for determining whether or not they were the same project, and thus could be sort of piled together to become a significant emissions increase. And more recently, in October 2020, EPA amended the rules again with the project emissions accounting rule, which allowed both emissions increases and decreases to be considered at the first step of determining whether a modification results in a significant emissions increase. I will note that EPA has publicly stated that that project emissions accounting rule is under review there within EPA because that occurred just at the end of the last administration. So the new administration, they're looking at but no word on whether anything will happen with that or not. Finally, this map is a little small. You can pull up the ANPR and look at it a little more closely, but this just shows where those current major sources are within Louisville Metro. This is important because most of these changes really only come into play when determining whether there is a significant net significant emissions increase at a source that is already major. So these are our Title V sources. I can't say for certain that all of them would be major for ozone necessarily already, but I would guess there's probably a pretty fair chance that pretty much all of these are major for either NOx or VOCs already. So this is significant. It just shows where they are within the city and who could be potentially affected by that, the additional flexibilities, as EPA says, of the NSR reform rules. Just really quickly to run through what this sort of means practically, I wanted to go through a couple of examples that we just came up with. These are I think, relatively simple examples. There are definitely a lot more complex situations that come into play, but they just sort of highlight what the impact of the change would be on the sort of highest level. So example one, a completely new source with the potential to emit 100 tons per year of NOx or VOCs. This doesn't change at all. New source review applies both under the current version of 204 and the current federal rule, as this would be a new major stationary source. On the other hand, a new source with the potential to emit 50 tons per year of NOx and 50 tons per year of VOCs, NSR doesn't apply under either version of the rule. You do not aggregate NOx and VOCs. It's a separate determination for each pollutant. For an existing FEDUP or synthetic minor, those federally enforceable district origin operating permits with a current total permitted potential of 80 tons per year of NOx or VOCs, say they plan a new project adding a potential of 20 tons per year of the same pollutant for which they already have 80 tons. NSR would not apply under 204 or the current federal rule. It's not an existing major source, so NSR would only apply if the project is major in and of itself. So that 20 tons per year could be theoretically anything up to 99 tons per year, and NSR doesn't apply. And this, it wouldn't change under the new rule. That's how it is now. However, it's important to note that source, if it goes over 100 tons per year, would then be an existing major source, so any other modification that is greater than 40 tons per year could trigger NSR. Example 4, sorry, I lost count. I should have numbered these. So say an existing major source for NOx or VOCs plans a project to update an existing unit, and this project would lead to an increase of 50 tons per year of the same pollutant for which they're already major. But based on historical use, the plant only expects using the new capacity at 50%. In other words, they only expect actual emissions to increase by 25 tons per year. This is where that actual to projected actual test comes into play. Currently, under Regulation 204 version 7, new source review would apply. You don't look at that projected actual, you just look at the current, or I'm sorry, the potential of that project. So under the new CFR, that source would not be subject, or that modification would not be subject to new source review, but under 204 version 7 it would. Previously, though, a source that anticipated only that 50% capacity could take a limit, what we call an avoidance limit, of up to that significant net emissions increase level of 40 tons and have avoided NSR. That limit would have ended up in their permit as an enforceable permit limit. So if I am counting right, example number 5, an existing major source plans a new emissions unit with a capacity to emit 50 tons per year for which it is major, no new emissions unit, but based on historic usage of other units only expects to use it at 50% capacity. NSR is applicable under 204 or the current federal rule. The actual to projected actual test only applies to modifications at existing units. However, under either 204 version 7 or the new federal rule, the source could accept that same permit limit for 25 tons per year or anything up to that NSR avoidance limit of 40. So in either situation, they would have to accept that enforceable permit limit to avoid NSR. Say an existing source over the past 5 years has emitted 200 tons per year, or pretty steadily, exactly the same for every year. That change in the look-back period comes into play here. Under the current version of the rule, that 200 tons per year would be their baseline. So if they projected the new projects to lead to a source-wide emissions of 250 tons per year, or I'm sorry, potential of 270 tons per year. Sorry, lost the thread of my own hypothetical here. That would be a significant net emissions increase, because 200 to 270 is 70 tons per year increase, and that's over the significant threshold. However, if previous to those 5 years, there was a 2-year period where the average emissions were 250 tons per year, that new baseline would apply, and the net emissions increase could be just 20 tons per year instead. So NSR would be applicable under 204 version 7, but not under the current federal rule. The final one, just an example of how a plant-wide applicability limit could work. A plant can take a limit of, say, 200 tons per year and as many changes as they want, 150 to it. This was sort of abbreviated from an EPA example with a rather large number of changes in any given year. Under 204 version 7, previous to that PAL, each change would need to be evaluated individually to see if they individually aggregates ended up leading to a net significant emissions increase. However, under the federal rule, they could take that PAL instead, and as long as they stayed under that 200 tons per year, they would not have to evaluate each of those changes for NSR applicability. So that was a really quick run through of the ANPR, the changes, some examples. Feel free to raise your hands now, or if you've got any questions, feel free to just unmute yourself and speak up. We don't have so many people that really would create a problem. Going through to see if there are any hands. I don't see any right now.
Byron, this is Stuart McCollum with All Four. I didn't see a hand raise feature. I'm not as adept at WebEx.
That's okay.
My question, I have 2 questions. The first part is, you guys said that there are some requirements you are currently not meeting on that. If you can elaborate on those. And the second question, and when you say not meeting those, i.e. conformity with federal NSR rules. And then the second question I have is, can you speak on the availability and use of emission reduction credits for future permitting actions?
Sure. So I can do my best to answer those. With regard to the first one, the only thing that jumps out at me is that there is not actually an emissions offset requirement for NOx right now that I see in the rule. That may be my misunderstood reading of 204, but that 1.1 to 1 emission offset requirement doesn't appear to be in 204 to me. So we would need to add that. Most of what needs to be corrected, though, is just some cross-references that are outdated or mistaken, and little cleanups like that. So as far as actual requirements, just that offset, but most of those changes that would be in that sort of more minimal amendment would be corrected cross-references or cleanups to language and stuff like that. As to the use of ERCs, that is one that has gone on for some time. Under our rules right now, emissions reduction credits can be used to offset. However, that 1.1 to 1 generally would have to be since we were designated non-attainment, I believe. So those reductions would have had to have come after we were already designated. The idea being that you have to find a net improvement in the air quality since designation. The idea being to push us a little bit closer to attainment. So emissions reductions credits that are from shutdowns or anything like that that occurred prior to that August 2018. I don't know that those would be usable. I don't know that that's clearly spelled exactly in our rule either. So that's something we've had some discussion about. That's my recollection from the last time we discussed it, what our conclusion was. But if you have a more specific question or anything like that, feel free to ask or shoot us an email or anything like that. I'd like to try and look into it more. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that answers the second part. And just to clarify on the first part, you're saying that the major requirement that the interpretation is that you have the required offsets for VOC, but not the required offsets for NOx that would need to conform with federal NSR requirements. Is that correct?
That's my recollection and my understanding as I read through the rule. So I was going to see if I could pull up the specific section where those. Feel free if somebody else has a question, I can keep looking for this and come back to it. But so right now, Section 5.4 of Regulation 204 states that emissions reduction shall be such as to provide a net air quality benefits in the affected area. Sorry, contacts are starting to wear out on me for the day. Okay, emissions reduction shall be such as to provide a positive net air quality benefit in the affected area. The net air quality benefit shall not be less than 15% for VOCs, thus requiring an emissions offset ratio of 1.5 to 1. Atmospheric simulation modeling is not necessary for VOCs and NOx. Compliance with Section 5.3 and 6.7 will be adequate to meet this condition. But we're required to have that 1.1 to 1 for either NOx or VOCs. I don't find that for NOx in a rule right now. Just that general requirements of a net positive impact for the area. So 6:30 right now. Does anybody have any other questions? We'll give it just a few minutes. Glad to skip back to any of these slides as needed. Thanks, Michelle. She dropped a link to the current version of 204 in there in the chat.
Aaron, if you don't mind, I'll just add that whether we change the rule or not, if anyone has a non-attainment NSR or PSD project, get with us early, and the devil's in the detail with this. So even if we don't change the rule, there's a lot of nuance to it, certainly if we do. So start early and communicate often. Thanks.
Yeah, good point, Matt. Thanks. Sounds like that storm's starting while people are thinking it through and see if they have any questions. I'm going to go close my window. While we're waiting, I'll also note, in addition to the recording, as I mentioned earlier, the slides from today's presentation should be posted to the docket along with this action tomorrow morning, I would expect. The link is right at the top of the presentation slide here right now, louisvilleky.gov/APCD/docket. And it's all the way down at the bottom below the proposed action, since this is an advance notice. So if you don't see it at the top, just scroll on down.
Byron and Matt, I actually have another question here, and this is regarding really to the timeline from where we are now to where things have to be. If I read the slides correctly, you said it's August the 3rd, 2021, where the rule has to be submitted to EPA. Would that indicate that the Air Pollution Control Board would have to vote to approve that in the July meeting?
At the very latest. Our hope is to put out a proposal relatively shortly after the ANPR closes. We have not received any comments yet. Depends on how many comments we receive in the last couple of days of the comment period here. But hopefully getting that out before the end of April and potentially bringing it to the board as early as May. The reason for trying to get it so far in advance of that August deadline is we actually have to submit it to the Division for Air Quality, the state agency, and they submit it to EPA on our behalf. They don't have another comment period requirement or anything, but it takes a little time to make it up through their signature chain and all of that. So we have already we've already provided this ANPR, of course, to our EPA and DAQ folks. So hopefully they're already working on the process of seeing if they have any issues with it. So we anticipate to meet that deadline still, but yeah, that's the timeline right now.
So I think, you'll notice that we're somewhere between our current rule and incorporating what seems to be the current federal rule on this. I think if we were to get some good but unique ideas as we work through this process, it might be something that we get our current rule approved or make minor changes and get it approved. But if we're having a good conversation, or if there really is a good plan to make this a better reg for our community, I think we could continue that conversation. But we don't use this rule very often. Not many large projects come through. So I'm not expecting some kind of thinking outside of the box on this, really picking any that we may want of the current enhancements to this rule and packaging that up pretty quickly.
It's 6:35. We've had a little discussion going on since sort of open the comment period here, or the question and answer section. Give it another minute or two, see if anybody else has any questions. But as always, of course, feel free to email us if something pops into your head after the fact. errorregs@louisvilleky.gov.
Just to help for my clarification, Byron, on this, for the public notice period too, are you going to require 30 days of public notice on the official public rulemaking before the board would vote? Or is that a 60-day process? So is it 60 days from May to July before they can vote on it? Because the rule has to be, or is that a 30-day process?
We're required
to kind of elaborate on that portion of it where it goes from rule to adjustments to vote.
We're required to give a minimum 30-day public notice. That's a requirement from EPA's rules as well as our own for any rule change that's going to be incorporated in SIP from the EPA requirement. Unless we receive significant comments, as Matt indicated, I would anticipate it likely going out for that shorter, around 30-day public comment period. if we receive any significant comments and end up considering some more significant changes or something, really outside the box, we probably think about doing a longer comment period. Right now, as I said, the earliest we are aiming to possibly get it to the board would be that May board meeting, which would be, let's see, May the 19th. That would be a relatively expedited rulemaking process for something significant. But if we end up incorporating either just sort of minor changes or, pretty much exactly what's in the federal rule, I would anticipate that we could potentially meet that. But we did build in a little cushion before our sort of drop dead deadline to get it to DAQ to pass it along to EPA. So that may change, particularly depending on, like I said, what comments we get in the next couple of days. Right. Give it just one more minute here. I'm going to exit out of the presentation so I can make sure I'm not missing anybody in the full view here. All right. Sounds like the storm is passing here as well, Rachel. She says it's already passed out to the west of us a little bit here. And I think our meeting may be passing with the storm, unless anybody else has any significant questions. I think Mother Nature has spoken for us. But again, look for these slides and a recording to be posted to the docket for this action tomorrow morning. Please do take a look at that full ANPR, and if you have any thoughts, feel free to comment. It doesn't have to be anything in depth, i.e. you should change section blah, blah to state exactly this. Feel free to even just shoot us a general. We think you should remain more stringent, or you should add flexibility, or you should make it even harder or even easier than what's in the current rule or the federal rules. We welcome any and all comments. Also, feel free to email us any questions. Feel free to give me a call. My number is 502-574-7253. I am still working from home, so I probably won't answer, but I get email, get notifications when I get voicemails now, so I should be able to call you back relatively quickly. Easiest may be to just email us at airrigs@louisvilleky.gov, though. Michelle has put a link to the docket there. The docket does include the full advance notice, as well as a brief sort of fact sheet about the action. And remember that deadline to comment is Friday. So please do reach out to us with any and all thoughts. And with that, unless there are any more questions here, scroll through, I still don't see any hands. I'll say thank you, everybody, for attending. Pretty good turnout for a Wednesday evening meeting. Thanks, everybody. And thanks for the thoughtful questions, Stuart.
Always. Thank you all for your time tonight and presenting this information.